Right, hello again, Year 10. So this is just a short introduction to the work you're going to be doing today on President Johnson and the Great Society. Okay. Now, most of you, you know that you had your PPE set on Monday, right? The due time for that, if you haven't done it already, is by tomorrow, please. Okay, so tomorrow after school, I'll be checking who's done it then. That's still uploaded in tasks, okay? So you can find that in assignments. That needs to be done by tomorrow, please, if you've not done it already, Year 10. Okay, so we've got a couple of topics left just to finish off the America paper. The first one is Johnson and the Great Society. And then in our next lesson, we're going to be looking at the feminist movement in the late 1960s. And then we'll finish with America and we're going to start the Cold War. So before we start today, I want you to make sure you've got your exercise book out, and I'd like you to have today's title down, okay? Which is President Johnson and the Great Society. So quickly just pause the video here if you don't have your exercise book and get that title down. Okay, so Johnson and the Great Society. So, first of all, quick reminder of where we got up to last time when we looked at Kennedy and the New Frontier. So we saw last lesson that Kennedy became president in 1961, and his ambitious program to reform America in the 60s was known as the New Frontier. Okay, so that idea of the frontier in American culture being very important. We saw the New Frontier had a number of successes. So we saw Kennedy's ability to increase the minimum wage, the creation of the Peace Corps, and then the increases in Social Security payments. But then we also saw that in Kennedy's short presidency, a number of his more ambitious plans failed. So particularly his attempts to create Medicare, which would have given free healthcare to the elderly and the unemployed, and then also federal funding for schools. And both of those programs were blocked by Southern politicians who were angry at Kennedy's tentative support for civil rights. Okay. Now, Kennedy obviously was then assassinated, so he was only in power for 2 years, which is worthwhile keeping in mind when we judge his successes and his failures. He was assassinated in 1963. There was a wave of sympathy for the Democrats, and then Johnson, as we'll see today, was re-elected in 1964. So today we're going to be looking at what Johnson's Great Society was. We're going to be looking at the main successes and also the criticisms of Johnson's Great Society, and then we're going to try judging the success of the Great Society at the end, so weighing it up. How far did it reach its goals overall? Just a quick reminder about where Johnson fits in with our timeline of American presidents. So we saw in the 1950s there had been 8 years of Republican rule. So President Eisenhower ruled from 1953 to 1961. Kennedy then defeated Eisenhower's Vice President Nixon in a general election, and Kennedy became president in 1961. Now, he was a Democrat, and Johnson was originally his vice president. But when Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, Johnson took over. So in Kennedy's team, Johnson had been the vice president, but the way it works in America is if the president is killed or dies in office, their vice president takes over and finishes off their term. So Johnson was a Democrat, very much like Kennedy, and he took office in 1963 after Kennedy's assassination. Now, what then happened is he stood for office in his own election, as it were, in 1964, and he won a landslide. So the Democrats won a massive majority, and that made it very easy for him to get a lot of the laws he wanted to implement passed. And he partly rode a kind of wave of sympathy the Democrats had because of the assassination of Kennedy and the fact that people were genuinely inspired by Kennedy's vision of the New Frontier, and then also Johnson's campaign for a great society, which is what he stood in the 1964 election on. Now, a couple of things about Johnson. He was a very experienced politician. So unlike Kennedy, he was a lot older. So he was about 20 years older than Kennedy. So he was very experienced. He was very clever. And he was also slightly devious, but in a way that allowed him to get things done. He was also seen as a bit of a deal maker. So he'd worked in the Senate previously, which is like Parliament in America. And he had a lot of experience there about knowing how to win allies and how to get unpopular laws passed. And he was very, very good at just kind of like the nitty gritty of politics. And that meant that he was able to actually get most of the things, unlike Kennedy, that he wanted passed. Also worth noting that he was 6'5", so that meant he could be this quite intimidating character as well, but also quite charismatic in his own way. Now, Johnson decided to call his vision for America that he stood for in 1964 the Great Society. And the idea was that he was trying to sort of say that he wanted to build on the work of other Democrats in making America a more equal, fair society. So you can see this example here from this poster, Let's Keep Building the Great Society. And you can see there are pictures of Roosevelt, obviously famous for the New Deal, which you guys looked at, Truman and Kennedy. So it was this idea about this campaign to create a fairer, more equal, less unequal society, and that included things like investing in schools, healthcare for the poor and the elderly, and also particularly, as we're going to see, investing in trying to build public housing to get rid of slums and really poor quality housing. He was also known for his support for civil rights, and the most important civil rights legislation that was passed in the 60s was passed under Johnson's presidency. So you can see here Johnson inviting Martin Luther King to the White House to discuss his plans for the Voting Rights Act. It's a little quote about the Great Society there to give you an impression about what it was about. This is when Johnson stood in 1964. So he said, "The Great Society is a place where every child can find knowledge to enrich his mind and to enlarge his talents." So it's the idea about everyone should be given like an equal platform to succeed. And that was both about reducing poverty, increasing spending on schools, but also obviously about civil rights, because he wanted all children, including African American children, to have a platform to be successful. It is a place where the city of the man serves only the needs of the body and the demands of commerce, but the desire for beauty and the hunger for community. So it's not just about trying to become wealthy or doing well in business. It's about the desire for community. Okay, so it's a more equal vision of American society that's more about the community and not just about the individual. It is a place where men and none are more concerned with the quality of their goods than the quantity of their goods. So trying to build a slightly less materialistic society, a slightly equal, more fair and attractive one. Now, in terms of like Johnson's successes, unlike Kennedy, most of his major bills did actually pass, and he was seen as a very successful president in lots of ways. Now, just first of all, in terms of poverty in the economy, he managed to increase the minimum wage again. So we saw that Kennedy had done that. He'd increased the minimum wage from $1 to $1.25. Johnson was then able to improve that even further by increasing it up to $1.40. So that really helped Americans who were on the lower side of the income part of the spectrum, and was very useful for them. Also, Johnson was most famous for a lot of his bills to build public housing. Okay, so public housing in America is like council housing here. So it's housing that is subsidized and paid for by the government, that makes sure that poorer families don't have to live in slums or really awful conditions. So one of the acts he passed you read about was called the Model Cities Act. And the idea behind that was that they cleared out kind of slums, which were a massive thing in American cities in the 1960s, which might be surprising given how rich it was. And they made way for high quality public housing in the wake of it. And all the money that Johnson spent on the Great Society led to a massive reduction in poverty. So for those people living in desperate poverty, it more than halved from 18 to 8%. So that's a good figure to memorize. The number of people in desperate poverty fell from 18 to 8%. Okay. Now, what were you going to see as well? Criticisms of it. There was no doubt that Johnson was very successful in reducing poverty. Some people thought that the reforms cost too much money for the benefits they had. So that was one criticism. Another thing you'll see when you read the textbook is that by the end of the 1960s, there was rising unemployment in the inner cities in America. And particularly there was large-scale rioting, particularly following Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968. So there was still a lot of tension in America, even after 4 years of the Great Society happening. So it wasn't all rosy. Big success for Johnson was Medicare, which, as we said already, was the program to give free healthcare to the elderly and the unemployed. Johnson was able to get that passed. So unlike Kennedy, he was able to get Medicare passed. And to this day, Medicare still exists in America. That was a major achievement of Johnson's Great Society. Some other achievements of Johnson. Okay, so big area of success for Johnson was in the area of civil rights. Okay, so two big laws that he passed. The first one in 1964, the Civil Rights Act. Now that banned discrimination in employment and in public places. So what that basically meant is it made discrimination in jobs illegal. So if you couldn't not hire someone because they were African American after that law was passed, that was now illegal. And the discrimination in public places basically made segregation illegal. So that ended segregation in the American South. So that was a huge thing. It got rid of segregation and it banned discrimination in employment. Also really massive moment, in 1965, the following year, Johnson passed something called the Voting Rights Act, which you can see him signing here with Martin Luther King looking over his shoulder. And what that basically did was it made illegal all of the methods that the southern states had used to block African Americans from voting. So they'd never actually written down in law, oh, you can't vote if you're black. What they'd done is they created all these other ways of trying to stop African Americans voting. So things like literacy tests, when obviously that was at a time when most African Americans would have had very bad schooling, and also things like not protecting African Americans from attacks from the KKK when they did try to vote. So the Voting Rights Act basically protected African Americans to vote, and it basically led to all those Southern African Americans being able to vote at last. Okay. He had massively managed to reduce the number of African Americans in poverty from 56% to 30% by 1968, but obviously that was still much higher than the 8% which the rest of the American population had. Okay, so that was one criticism, that although he did a lot to reduce extreme poverty for African Americans, it was still way higher than it was for their white counterparts. And then obviously also the fact that you had all these rights in 1968 showed that while Johnson had a lot of achievements when it came to civil rights, nevertheless African Americans were still very frustrated with the lack of progress in other areas like police violence, increasing imprisonment, and also poverty. Okay, so worth keeping in mind. Also with education, Johnson managed to get past a lot of the bills that Kennedy had been unable to. So we saw last time that Kennedy was unable to get his plans for federal funding for schools passed. Johnson was able to do that. He was also able to create his own program called Operation Head Start, that specifically was targeted at giving sort of nursery age education to people in poorer neighborhoods. So it was to give young people a head start in life who grew up in poverty in the inner city. So Operation Head Start, like Medicare, still exists to this day in America. It's still a very popular program. Okay, guys, so what you need to do is you've got 8 questions here on Johnson and civil rights and the Great Society. You can find the answers to those questions on this page here, which is at page 55 if you've got your, or page 56 even. No, page 55. It's on page 55 if you've got your revision textbooks. If you've not, you can find this picture in files, okay? So I've taken a picture and put it in there. You've got 8 comprehension questions there I'd like you to do, okay? You can pause the video here if you want to and just take it off of this. Just do it on your exercise book. You don't need to type it in. So once you've answered those 8 questions using page 55, okay, there's also then an end of lesson quiz and assignments I'd like you to complete. And also there is, like last time, a very short 4-marker exit pass and assignments describe 2 successes of the Great Society. Remember, like last time, you need to have 2 develop points for that, okay? So answer your comprehension questions, complete the end of lesson quiz, and do the exit pass, and then that's the work for today. So, final thing just before we go. Good to finish up with some key takeaways. So, key takeaways, we saw that Johnson became president in 1963 following the assassination of Kennedy. We saw that his package of programs to create a fairer and more equal society in America was known as the Great Society. We saw that Johnson was able to pass most of the bills he had in mind to build the Great Society. So unlike Kennedy, he'd been able to actually get most of his bills passed, and Medicare and Medicaid both passed. He was able to get key civil rights legislation passed, and he was also able to do a lot of things for slum clearances and also federal education funding. But we did see then that Johnson nevertheless decided not to stand for re-election in 1968, even though he could have, okay? Now, the key reason that Johnson didn't stand for re-election in 1968 is a lot of his good work on the Great Society was undermined by 2 things. The first was the big-scale urban rioting in 1968. So after Martin Luther King was assassinated, there was huge rioting across a lot of the American inner cities that reflected kind of like the ongoing racial tensions and division in American cities. So those riots made Johnson quite unpopular because they happened under his watch. And then also, really importantly for Johnson, he became increasingly unpopular because he escalated the war in Vietnam, which by the end of the 1960s has become very unpopular. It cost a lot of money, a lot of lives, and also a lot of Americans came to think of it as being unwinnable, as well as some of them seeing it as immoral. Okay, so those are your key takeaways for Johnson. Good luck with the work. If you've got any questions, just put them in reply to the conversation. I will get back to you as soon as I can.